Hello everyone and welcome to this course. I am Professor Scaramelli. I'm an anthropologist of the environment and science. I have researched environmental conflicts over wetlands in Turkey, citizen science and issues of water quality here in Boston, and I'm currently working on seeds and agrobiodiversity across the Mediterranean. I initially came to this field driven by a curiosity about how the sheer diversity of our human experiences and societies, how they're mutually transformed with the environments in which we live. And I imagine all of you also share this curiosity. Maybe some of you have worked for an environmental conservation program or have read about community struggles for environmental justice. You might be here because you want to learn about the varied relationships humans have formed with varied environments, from mountain ranges to marshes, tropical islands, rainforests, industrial wetlands, and megalopolis. Perhaps you're here because you come from a family of farmers, fishers, cheesemakers, coal miners, or petroleum engineers, and you have witnessed these relationships of environmental transformation and co-constitution of human societies and the landscapes in which they live over the course of your lives. Some of you might have been affected by the disproportionate exposure to environmental toxicity or have grown up in a so-called food desert. Some of you might have read news stories about wildfires, storms, increasing deforestation. You might have experienced environmental degradation and loss in your own community. You might be into urban gardening or passionate about the science and culture of climate change. Some of you might think more in terms of quantifiable and measurable processes, and others of you might be more drawn to the elusive contingency of the human experience as we make and unmake cities, forests, fisheries, wetlands, farmlands, and other types of landscapes. If you're here by chance, I hope you stay. Welcome. In this course, we will consider some of the most pressing environmental issues of the contemporary moment, with a global outlook and a particular attention to the localized cultural dynamics and complex historical legacies. We will dive right into intractable ethical dilemmas and complex problems with multiple angles and perspectives. How do you balance environmental conservation with questions of land sovereignty and histories of indigenous dispossession and colonial control? How do communities come to care about climate change? How might environmental scientists draw from indigenous knowledge without objectifying it? Can animals become family? Who benefits from bioprospecting? What is it like to be a farmer in a large GMO soybean plantation? We will address these and many more questions over the course of the semester. The fundamental starting point of this class is that humans construct and shape their environments in ways that are both material and symbolic, and in turn, they are shaped by them. This class will introduce you to some of the ways in which anthropologists study things like participatory conservation, bioprospecting, land grabs, environmental precarity, climate change, agriculture, toxic exposure, and environmental justice. We will move across all continents and through different communities, learning to understand phenomena refracted across different scales, from the everyday experience to large transnational global processes. 1 week, you will be with local fishers in an island in Tanzania, and the week after you will be with farmers in the Indian Himalayas, and then with environmental justice activists and ordinary residents in Puerto Rico, and then with conservation scientists and indigenous peoples in Indonesia, and then with soybeans farmers in Paraguay, and then back to the United States debating with industrial engineers and environmental activists about the effects of an oil refinery near your home. This first lecture is going to be a little abstract. Bear with me. We will talk about anthropology and the concept of culture and the idea of environment and its related concept of nature and wilderness. So let's start from anthropology. Anthropology as a discipline is grounded in the contingency and specificity of the human experience, in what people say, do, and believe, in the concrete minutiae of their everyday lives. But we also address big universal questions about shared experiences and feelings and questionings. Its fundamental premise as a discipline is that communities and individuals make their own systems of meanings, ethics, and practices. People can hold distinct sets of beliefs and see the world in completely different ways. And yet humans are also inherently plastic, communicative, and the boundaries of identity are malleable and porous and ever-changing. Anthropologists also foreground questions of power relations, studying the ways in which inequalities and distinctions are reproduced, and also paying attention to everyday resistance against these power structures. Anthropology is typically divided into 4 fields, especially in the United States. So alongside archaeologists, there are biological, linguistic, and cultural anthropologists. So now I want to talk about the concept of culture, which is central to this course and to the discipline of anthropology. Culture is a word that derives from a Latin word that means to cultivate, to tend to processes of natural growth, the growth of plants and animals. So think of the word agriculture, they share a root. It also means historically to honor and to worship. Think of the word cult. But the 16th century, in several European languages, culture also encompassed the meaning of tending to the human development, or specifically the human mind. But in the 20th century, culture meant a set of collective beliefs, orientations, and worldviews connected to practices and social institutions. Different groups of humans had different and distinct cultures. So before then, in the late 19th century, particularly in certain Euro-American contexts, culture had become a synonym with civilization. And this was broadly a racialized, hierarchical term. Humans, some thinkers believed, lived in different stages of civilization. And there was an obvious line of development from savagery to the barbarians to contemporary urban civilizations. And some human groups, people believed and argued, were forever stuck in inferior stages historically, but also in their contemporary moment. This notion of culture and civilization in hierarchical, progressive, linear stages provided a moral and intellectual justification for colonialism, slavery, and racist thought. But in the early 20th century, the idea of culture underwent a revolution against these racist ideas. Culture became the capacity that all humans had to make meanings, to form groups, to decide on their ethical priorities and conventions. It was no longer innate, but learned and chosen. It was not universal, but relative. And there were no biological distinctions or hierarchies between human groups. Further, no culture or practice was better or worse. They were just different. This idea was powerful, it was anti-racist, and it was a clear response to the ethno-nationalist-driven genocides of the early 20th century. But it was also static. It presumed that each human society had a culture, like a bubble or a vase that contained them. It posited migrants, for example, as stuck between cultures, forever in-betweens, portrayed indigenous peoples now living in cities and holding working class or wage or professional jobs as having lost their culture and as being worse for it. It underplayed change, resilience, invention, fluidity, and the human ability to draw from different systems of thought, belief, and practice and to reinvent ourselves. So I want to think about for a minute, is culture a word you use? If so, why? If not, also why not? And if you do use it, in which context do you find it most useful? Now we're getting into the other two key terms of our course, environment and nature. But first I want to give you a little head-spinning short history of early humans. Bear with me for a couple of minutes. So first, early hominids have been around for around 4 to 5 million years in today's Central East Africa. 200,000 years ago, communities of what we now call Homo sapiens, they're hunters and gatherers. They mostly forage from coastlines and move following the coasts of lakes, seas, and rivers. They eat lean meat and animal fat, and mollusks and berries, fruits, seeds, honey, plants, tubers. Driven by climate cooling, around 60,000 years ago, these Homo sapiens communities crossed the Red Sea, travel into India, and then from there Australia. They head into today's Middle East, Central Africa, North Asia, Europe, and then they cross a land bridge to Alaska, arriving in South America around 15,000 years ago. For the past 400,000 years, humans have shaped the landscapes in which they lived. First, by using large fires to control vegetation and the movement of animals. And then by tending to wild plants, weeding them, dropping seeds in new locations, gathering them, replanting their chosen varieties. And finally, by forming relationships with animals such as dogs, goats, sheep, reindeers, llamas, pigs, and more, and attracting some of them to live into or near their domus, their homes or settlements. From around 40,000 years ago, all over the world, we see cave paintings featuring animals together with human shapes. These paintings show that animals are at the center of people's spiritual and everyday lives. Relationships with animals are fundamental for forging a sense of self and community and of the transcendental or spiritual. So wherever they went, humans modified landscapes and environments and controlled the reproduction and behavior of countless species of plants and animals. About 9,000 years ago, people in Southeast Asia are tending to tropical gardens with starchy roots and tree crops, pigs, rice, sugarcane, and chickens. Rice is actually quite labor-intensive and doesn't become a staple food until around only 200 years ago. In North China, people eat millet, soybeans, and raise pigs and water buffaloes. In the highlands of South America, around 5,000 years ago, you have potatoes, quinoa, and domestic llamas, alpacas, and guinea pigs. A little north, in today's central Mexico, people raise squash, maize, and beans, what is now called the milpa complex, and there are no domestic animals. Back in Africa, the African megafauna, the big cats, the elephants, giraffes, they have learned to live with people over many hundreds of thousands of years. They've become smart at avoiding them. And humans domesticate sorghum, millet, and cattle. But in Australia, animals like the giant marsupial lion, an animal called the diprotodon, imaging a giant wombat, and the 2.5 meter long Myalonia platyceps and armored tortoise with horns and thick shell, these quickly become extinct after the relatively sudden arrival of humans about 50,000 years ago. So this planet has been modified by human practices for hundreds of thousands of years. This is why a common notion of the environment as that which is around me and untouched by me, that which has its own agency separated from the actions of humans, falls a little bit short when you think about this time scale. So what is the environment? Environment derives from a French word meaning simply surrounding. In 19th century, it begins to be used to indicate the varied subjects of the emerging natural sciences. For some people today, environment is pretty much a synonym with nature, whatever that might be. For others, it is very much about human relationships with landscapes, from fields to oceans to cities. And yet for others, environment is simply a space or a field in which relationships between different organisms, forces and elements unfold. Now, I would like you to pause this video for a couple of minutes, take out a piece of paper and a pen, and I want you to draw the environment. Whatever comes to mind, whatever it means to you, just draw. It doesn't have to be pretty, you don't have to be good at drawing. I just want you to draw, to express your ideas through scribbles and doodles. And I would like you to bring your drawing to the class to start a conversation. It's been a couple of minutes, you've done your drawing of the environment. I want you to think about how the environment is closely related with the idea of nature, and this is a very big one to tackle. So etymologically, nature derives from a Latin word meaning to be born. A cultural historian called Raymond Williams pointed out 3 different ways in which Europeans have used the word historically from about the 13th century to the 20th century. Number 1, nature is the essential quality and characteristic of something. For example, the nature of human beings. Number 2, nature as an inherent force that directs the world. For example, think of the pandemic as a natural catastrophe. Number 3, nature can mean the material world itself, a definition that can variably include or exclude human beings. For example, I love being in nature, or nature is resilient. In practice, however, we often use and have historically used the word nature to mean all 3 of these meanings. And very often a combination of them, even at the same time, where the word can mean all these things at the same time. They intersect, and this is what makes it a very complicated and slippery word. Nature is often posed in opposition to something else that it is not. Nature and religion, nature and culture, nature and nurture, and so forth. But when you think of nature, what comes to mind? I personally think of several things. The mountain peaks surrounding the town where I was born in the northern Italian Alps. I think about the natural processes that make my body work. I think about a system of universal order, which I could potentially describe in scientific terms and laws. I think of nature pointing to something immutable, inevitable, essential. And I also think about how we use the word to make specific arguments about the world. The concept has a very complex history and multiple meanings, but I want to show you that it is often constructed in opposition to something else. And this distinction, however it is made, has important effects on the world. So I want you to take a couple of minutes again and take a piece of paper to write down your thoughts and think about an example in which someone might invoke the concept of nature to draw a distinction between two different things. One natural or about nature and the other one not, outside of it. Write it down on a piece of paper, and I would like you to bring your answer to class to discuss with others. And now when you're done, look at your drawing of the environment that you did just a few minutes ago, and this example of the use of nature that you just wrote down. What do they have in common, if anything? Are they related? Are they the same thing? Are they distinct? And where does the notion of culture fit in all of this? This is for you to ponder for now, and we will return to these big questions and these abstract terms at the end of the course, grounded by concrete examples of how communities have wrestled with these ideas and concepts and critiques. In the European Enlightenment, nature was something that should be conquered, studied, classified. In European Romantic thought, nature provided solace from the trapping of civilization. This is a story we often tell about nature, but it does convey a specifically regional intellectual story. What other traditions are you bringing into this class? I would like you to share them in our class discussion next week. Now I want to get into the final concept for this session. It's the idea of the wilderness, that which is wild or untamed, untouched by human influence, even in some meanings of the term uncultured or outside of culture. This is a concept, the concept of the wilderness, that continued to pervade environmental thought through the 20th century and continues to have an important cultural salience to this day. The two readings that accompany us this week provide a bit of a historical background and a set of critiques to the notion of nature and wilderness in environmental conservation, specifically in the context of the United States. So the first reading that we are considering this week is an essay published in 1995 entitled "The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature" by William Cronon, who is an environmental historian of North America. The second essay is from a book that was published 20 years later in 2014. It's by geographer Caroline Finney, and her book is entitled "Black Faces, White Spaces: Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors." Cronon opens his essay with the remark that when we look at the wilderness as a sanctuary of pristine, untouched nature, a common interpretation for 20th century environmental thought, we are in fact looking at ourselves. As he writes, the reflections of our longings and desires. In the late 19th century, in the United States, wilderness acquired new moral and symbolic values. There were certain places, cliffs, waterfalls, mountain peaks, gorges, that offered a manifestation of the divine, a concept called sublime, and that evoked powerful emotions. In the context of European settlers in North America, this was co-constituted with the idea of the frontier, a place where people leave the trappings of civilization and rediscover their primitive energy, reinfused with the vigor and independence that formed the basis of American nationhood. The frontier, which is a myth, it's an origin story that certain people hold about themselves, was a world of nostalgia, a world that was already lost. It was a world of rugged masculinity, a world of white Europeans. A wilderness, in this sense, was also an elite pursuit. Cronon points out that the people who benefited the most from industrial capitalism, the wealthier ones, were the ones who could access private hunting estates and later nature preserves and national parks. Communities of Native Americans dispossessed from lands that would later become assigned as national parks, were often written out of the story. These were imagined as spaces of untouched, pristine nature, where humans had barely set foot on, and local users became illegal poachers, trespassers. William Cronon points out that the concept of the wilderness, which appears to be transcendental, timeless, universal, in fact hides its own history. A history based on obscuring the histories of land use and conflict, Native American sovereignty, settler colonialism, and dispossession. Cronon writes, "Only people whose relation to the land was already alienated could hold up wilderness as a model for human life in nature. For the romantic ideology of wilderness leaves precisely nowhere for humans beings actually to make their living from the land." This is the central paradox. Wilderness embodies a dualistic vision in which the human is entirely outside of the natural. So when we overvalue wilderness as nature without people, many corners of the world then become unnatural and then therefore no longer worthy of care and of protection. We reproduce a logic of marginalization and dispossession of human communities from areas demarcated as conservation lands. We devalue the experiences of people working on the land and pit environmentalists against small-scale farmers. This is Cronon's argument in the essay. Now, Cronon does not completely dismiss the wilderness. In fact, he's just prodding us to consider its cultural and political history and the implication of that concept as a justification for certain types of conquest and dispossession. But wilderness, Cronon concludes, is a state of mind. It's an attunement to wonder, to seeing the unfamiliar, the transcendental, the wonderful, the fantastic, even in the most ordinary landscapes. And so then Cronon argues in the conclusion of his essay, we can and should bring the concept home to our own parks and backyards and cities. Now, this essay was extremely controversial when it was published in 1995. And I wanted to think about who would have disagreed with his analysis then. Is it as provocative now, 25 years later? Why or why not? Does it challenge your own understanding of nature? Or does it reaffirm your knowledge and your beliefs? And what do you think Cronon leaves out of this analysis? Now, I want to juxtapose this essay with another work unpacking the notion of the American wilderness, written around 20 years later. Carolyn Finney is the daughter of caretakers on a large estate just outside of New York City. She grows up loving the oaks, beeches, apples, and peaches that her parents are tending to as they take care of the land. But she also learns that neighbors do not see her and her family, the only Black family in the area at the time, as naturally belonging there. So she's writing all of this in the introduction to her book. She starts to think about land and ownership and who is represented in environmental conversations. She begins studying the way African Americans have told stories and transformed the landscapes, and the connections to land and the environment that they nurtured individually and collectively. She worked on this research against hegemonic narratives that largely diminished or misconstrued African American environmental relationships. Her book, Black Faces, White Spaces, broadly argues that environmentalism and the meanings we attribute to the environment are grounded in history, in race, gender, and culture. And in the book specifically, she tells us she uses the word environment largely to mean outdoor green spaces. So I wanted to bracket that definition. She's not talking about environmental struggles in cities and at the edge of factories. Finney focuses on questions of collective memory and racialized representations of the outdoors constructed as universal and authentic, but however excluding many communities' histories and experiences. This narrative has historically precluded environmental organizations from attracting African Americans in environmental activities, both as managers or as visitors to green spaces. So for example, in 1985 to 1987, only 2% of national park visitors were African Americans, compared to 94% of white visitors. And in 2002, out of 44,000 Forest Service employees, only about 1,300 were African Americans. So Finney's work emphasizes some of the historical exclusions of African Americans from cultural notions of the wilderness, the great outdoors, and national parks, a legacy that she argues continues today as African Americans are still largely underrepresented both as visitors to national parks and as park staff. The environmental struggles, the claims for land and environmental justice movements led by African Americans had not received as much attention as the heroic pursuits of white middle-class American environmentalists, at least until very recently. So is this something you two had thought about or noticed before? Do you agree or disagree? This book was published about 6 years ago. Have things changed since then? What has changed and what hasn't in your own experience? What do you think are some of the factors that have contributed to these underrepresentations, and have things changed, and what has driven this change? So in this unit, we have tackled a lot of big ideas. I introduced you to the work of anthropologists. I gave you a very head-spinning history of early humanity and the plants and animals and environments they modified. And then we unpacked the big notions of culture, nature, environment, wilderness. You have learned or have been reminded that these terms have complex histories and can convey multiple and even contradictory meanings. So when you use these words in your own work over the course of the semester and in your academic work and professional work outside of this class, I want to encourage you to be specific and concrete in describing the precise ways in which you're using them to indicate what, and what you want to illuminate in a process or an idea by using these big concepts. This is all for this week. Thank you for joining me.